Thank you. I'm going to focus on this from a primarily philosophical and ethical perspective. Even though I teach in the law school here, my interests are very much abstract and conceptual and not practical. That's mainly because I'm quite a lazy researcher. I don't like getting my hands dirty with empirical data and information, and actually reading cases and statutes is rather difficult for me. So I prefer to reflect on things from the privileged position of my armchair in the ivory tower of academia, and I hope that my rational intuition will tell me what the right answer about things is. So the question I have posed for this talk is relating to the ethical status of commercial surrogacy, and should that be an option that's considered in Ireland. And what I want to do, really, I don't have any definitive view on this, but I want to problematize, to use a hideous academic word, the notion that altruistic forms should be the default, or the view that altruistic forms are it's easy to police the boundary between altruistic and commercial forms of surrogacy. I think that's not entirely true. So I want to start with some clarification. Throughout this discussion, I'm assuming a gestational model of surrogacy in which a commissioning couple will form or procure an embryo for implantation in a surrogate mother, and the surrogate mother is the birth mother, not the genetic mother. That just makes it easier for me for this conversation, but I'm not sure that any of the substantive kind of considerations or arguments that I look at differ if you look at genetic surrogacy. Right, so I want to start by just clarifying some concepts and definitions. I'm going to define commercial surrogacy for present purposes as a situation in which a surrogate mother receives a payment above and beyond actually incurred expenses. So they make some sort of profit on the commercial surrogacy, or on the surrogacy agreement. And I'll just define altruistic surrogacy as the opposite of that, the negation of that situation in which the surrogate mother does not receive a payment above and beyond expenses. Now, I said they are reasonable expenses, but as we've heard from Deirdre's talk, the concept of reasonable expenses is problematic, and really you could argue that many jurisdictions which have reasonable expenses as a provision have commercial surrogacy in all but name. It's important to bear in mind what commercial surrogacy is not, according to this definition. Commercial surrogacy is not a situation in which you have a free market or private contractual model of surrogacy in which the commissioning couples, the fertility clinics, and the surrogate decide the terms and conditions of their own agreement and the price. And that's not what commercial surrogacy entails, according to my definition. In fact, it's consistent with my approach that you could have an entirely state-run or state-regulated market in which the state sets the price and the terms and conditions and ensures that there's a protection of the interests of the surrogate and the different parties to the arrangement. Just an illustration of this, maybe a controversial illustration of this. Some people might know this. Iran is the only country in the world that pays people for kidney donations. It's also the only country in the world where there's no waiting list for kidney transfers or kidney transplants. And this, the Iranian model is problematic in various ways, and it's gone through a number of iterations, but at least in its initial form, it was an entirely state-controlled market in which there was a state price for kidney donations. They fixed the price, and the state paid the donor, not the individual looking for the transplant. So that's a feasible commercial model according to my definition. Okay. The thing then is, when you're looking at any proposed policy, using an ethical perspective on this, you want to avoid a bias towards the status quo. So you need to conduct a comparative assessment of any proposed policy, such as a commercial surrogacy policy. The reason for that is that oftentimes people look at commercial surrogacy and they say it's got a lot of bad features and maybe some nice features. The bad features outweigh the nice features, therefore we shouldn't have it. That's the incorrect approach to take to any practical policy change, because you need to compare the bad features of the proposed policy with what the current situation is, and also with the best available alternative or contrasting proposal. So you need to conduct this kind of like three-way assessment where you're comparing what your proposal is to the status quo and to its nearest competitor. So in the present context, that means something like this. In Ireland, we essentially have a situation where there's legal limbo, there's no clear policy or certainty in relation to surrogacy arrangements. We could introduce an altruistic surrogacy arrangement. That seems to be the default position of the government. That's what they favor, at least that's what Leo Varadkar said in his interview about this last year. Or you could have a commercial surrogacy model. Now that's complicated in one sense, that you're comparing three different relationships here. But it's also complicated in another sense in that these are very fuzzy general categories. You can have many different forms of commercial surrogacy and many different forms of altruistic surrogacy. Now I'm going to stick to the very high level comparison, but bear in mind it's far more complicated than it looks on this slide. All right, so I want to look at just three kind of standard concepts that are used in the commercial surrogacy debate and arguments that are made in relation to those concepts. And my main goal here is to try and clarify the core ethical concepts that animate people's concerns about surrogacy, and then explore how those concepts are used in various arguments. So the first one is harm. This is actually a reverse order of my title presentation. So I'm going to use a fairly standard philosophical definition of harm as being a setback to life interests. Right? We're all, as human beings, interested in certain things, our health, our well-being, our education, our family, and so forth. These are often the foundation for human rights. There's a very popular philosophical theory called the interest-based theory of rights, which says anything you have an interest in, you have a right to. So they're related concepts. And then I would define benefit as just the opposite of that. It's a promotion of life interests, promotion of things like physical health, psychological well-being, education, family, and so forth. So as a starting point here, I presume that there are some benefits to surrogacy and commercial surrogacy, insofar as it allows people to have children that they would not otherwise be able to have. And that presumably promotes somebody's life's interests. Now, how good a thing this is, how significant the benefit is, depends on what your view is on whether people should have children and whether that's a positive thing in life. Some people think it's a really positive thing. Parents often think it's less positive. So from that starting point, I assume there's some benefit to it. What are the potential harms of surrogacy and commercial surrogacy in particular? And remember, throughout this conversation, we have to conduct that comparative assessment. Right? So we have to compare the harms of commercial to altruistic surrogacy. That's the main comparison that I'm looking at. Right, so the first thing is harms to the surrogate. We've had some of these discussed so far today. There's the harm of hormone treatment and implantation, the risk of multiple conceptions and preterm births and things like that. Those are known risks, but they are definitely health risks associated with the process. You also have the harm of pregnancy itself. People mightn't always think of pregnancy as a harmful state, but it does carry health risks, some quite significant, and again, many well known. There's also then the harm to the surrogate, more long-term, the psychological harm of giving up the child, and the long-term effects of that. And we had some discussion of that this morning in Professor Gollenbuck's talk. So these are all genuine harms that are associated with surrogacy. The critical question here is whether they are more significant in the case of altruistic surrogacy as opposed to commercial surrogacy as opposed to altruistic surrogacy. All of those harms apply in the altruistic case just as well as they apply in the commercial case. The only thing that's different is that you might expect to have more of them in the commercial case, insofar as you might expect to have more surrogates. Okay? That said, all the harms are probably capable of being minimalized through appropriate healthcare, appropriate screening, and counseling for surrogates. You won't minimize them, you won't ever have a risk-free or harm-free situation, but you could minimize them through appropriate regulation and management. So it's not clear to me here that there's a decisive case against commercial forms when it comes to harms to the surrogate. Harms to children. I had a big debate with my partner about whether to include this slide, but she insisted that I include it. So I defer to Professor Gollenbuck's talk earlier on today on this matter, and I think the conclusion there was fairly clearly that there are no significant harms to children as a result of surrogacy arrangements. In fact, there may even be benefits. They may even be better adjusted than regular children, children born through normal families, whatever that might mean. The only thing that I'm not clear on is whether there's a significant difference between children born through altruistic surrogacy versus commercial surrogacy. I don't know if that's been examined in much detail in the literature. I know there are lots of studies, kind of more snapshot studies in the US, and most children born in the US are through the commercial form. And again, the findings there seem to be consistent with not significant degree of harm or no real difference in the populations. And I suspect the study on gay couples that was alluded to at the end of Professor Gollenbuck's talk would support that, at least in its initial findings. The other thing that is more kind of societal harms, in particular harms to women, this is something that concerns a lot of people, that really normalizing the practice of surrogacy has a certain symbolic meaning about the status and value of women's bodies in society, and this might reinforce negative stereotypes or systemic inequality of women. I'm going to defer discussing this until I talk about commodification, because ostensibly some of these symbolic harms arise in the altruistic case as well. What people usually argue is that there's more of them in the commercial case because you get more of the practice, and there's some additional problematic meaning if you commercialize the process, if you add a payment into the process. That's what happens through commodification, this kind of symbolic tainting of the practice. So I'll come back to that issue at the end. Second thing I wanted to look at was exploitation. So I'm trying to bring some conceptual clarity here. So what is exploitation? It's a term that's bandied around a lot. In the philosophical literature, we define exploitation as taking unfair advantage of somebody. So it's a situation in which you have an inequality of bargaining power that is exploited in one of two ways, or possibly both ways. You impose a very low benefit or significant burden on the weaker party, or you manipulate their consent in some way. You don't properly inform them or you coerce them. I mean, a good example of this during the week would possibly be the case about au pairs in Ireland. You've got wealthy middle-class couples who employ au pairs on arguably unfair terms. They're imposing unfair burdens, low benefits on them, and maybe also manipulating their consent insofar as these are often foreign nationals who may not fully understand their rights and entitlements under Irish law. So is commercial surrogacy exploitative? Well, the typical scenario involves a wealthy, well-educated, maybe well-advised, maybe not always actually well-advised, couple who procure the services of a relatively poor, not well-advised, not well-protected woman. And the concern is that they will impose unfair terms and conditions and manipulate the consent of that person. And India is often pointed to as the classic examples. This is the picture I had on the opening slide. This is a group of women living in a surrogacy clinic. It's part of the practice in India is that they are taken away from their families and they live in a clinic for a number of months. I don't know if they live there for the full duration of the pregnancy, but certainly during the latter stages of the pregnancy, they live in that kind of controlled environment. And again, the concern in India is that there's invalid consent because a lot of these women don't understand the language in which the contracts are drafted, and the terms and conditions of those contracts are really set up to benefit Western couples who are coming there for the service and not to protect the interests of the surrogate. Now that said, there are complexities in the Indian case, at least when we go back to that definition of exploitation, because it's not so much that a very unfair or very low benefit is imposed upon them. Actually, what people are typically concerned about in the Indian case is that it's too high a benefit. This is the philosophical argument that's made, because depending on which figures you look at, these women are being paid on average between 10 and 30 times, the figures I found, their expected annual average income if they were to take another job. So it's actually that this is a really good offer. It's an offer too good to refuse, and this is what's actually exploitative about it. It's manipulating their consent by giving them too good a monetary offer. So really this problem of exploitation in the Indian context has much more to do with systemic inequalities, including transnational inequalities. And the question is whether any regime could resolve those kinds of systemic inequalities or just reinforce them. I think there is reason for optimism, at least in an Irish or Western context, that you could have a less exploitative regime. I mean, one very simple thing you could do, has been suggested by some people, is that you could have a system of advocates for the surrogates within the process, or you could have very fixed terms and conditions within those contracts, again, if it's very much a state-controlled and regulated market, as opposed to a free market private contractual model. You can minimize exploitation in that way. And then there is the debate, which or an argument that some people make, is that altruistic forms of surrogacy can be more exploitative than commercial forms. I think this is something Deirdre kind of alluded to in her talk, and it's an argument that Jenny Milbank has made in the Canadian and Australian context, because usually in altruistic surrogacy regimes there are people making profit from it. Okay? The clinics make profit, usually. And in Canada, the brokers who link surrogates to commissioning couples make profit from it too. Right, so again, if you are a fan of Marxist theory, this is exploitative because you've got these capitalistic enterprises that are basically just extracting all the profit from women's labor. So maybe altruistic forms of surrogacy are more exploitative than commercial forms. Last thing then, commodification. Is this problematic? Just as a starting point to define commodification very simply is the process of taking some good or service and converting it into a commodity that can be bought and sold on a market. And in the context of surrogacy, the question is what is being commodified? What is it that's being taken and transformed into something that can be bought and sold? There are different interpretations of this. I think it's safe to say it's not children, because as we've heard from other talks, children are still going to be normal human beings and whose rights will probably, their best interests will trump any consideration in a surrogacy agreement. It's probably more like the gestational service that's being commodified, and possibly parental rights are being commodified, the transfer of parental rights is being commodified. So is that commodification problematic? Well, unless, and I know I might be contradicting myself here, unless you are some kind of radical Marxist or socialist, you probably don't have any intrinsic opposition to commodification. You accept the commodification of some things. It's permissible to buy and sell some things. And oftentimes, actually, markets can have positive impacts in terms of signaling the value of something. But there's a lot of debates about whether there should be better pay or should be pay for home care work or care work. These are things that are not properly valued by society because they're not paid for. Right? And it can also have positive impacts in terms of distribution of goods by making things cheaper and more available to people. That said, there are usually two main objections to commodification. One relates to fairness, that commodification will distribute goods and services to those who can afford to pay them. So if you look at debates about houses and house prices, the escalating cost of property and land in large urban areas seems to be an intrinsic feature actually of modern capitalist economies, and it's distributing land ownership away from poorer people to richer people. So maybe that's a negative impact of the market. And again, that would be the concern in the context of commercial surrogacy, is that the good or service in question will go to wealthy couples who get the benefit. And we saw some of the figures from the US. You're talking about a service that's costing between $75,000 and $150,000. Now, again, at least in theory, you could address those problems through some kind of subsidization or control of the market price. How practical that is another question. But the US might be a misleading example to some extent here, insofar as the US is probably a more unequal society in general, although we are all becoming more unequal societies, as Thomas Piketty's thesis about capital in the 21st century reveals, that most developed economies are becoming more unequal. But again, how feasible it is to use a commercial surrogacy regime to address problems of systemic inequality is a separate matter. But at least, again, in principle, you could address fairness-related objections. A far more interesting objection is a corruption-related objection. So this is a view that is associated with the Harvard-based philosopher Michael Sandel, who wrote a book called What Money Can't Buy, which is all about these kinds of objections, is that commodification, adding money to something, to a relationship, taints it or problematizes it in some way, either by reducing the volume of an important social good that's provided, or by distorting the meaning of that social good. So just very briefly run through Sandel's argument. He said, for any outcome in society, you probably have a number of pathways to that outcome, with two that are important. You have a non-commodified pathway where people produce the outcome through a sense of duty or honor, and you have a commodified pathway where they produce it through a kind of profit motive. They want to make money. So the desired outcome could be anything here. It could be increased number of surrogates. It could be increased number of organ donations. There are many debates about commodification. So Sandel's concern is that by opening up the commodification pathway, the commodified pathway, you somehow corrupt either the outcome or the other pathway. So two ways that this can happen. You can cut off the other pathway to the good. So Sandel's go-to example of this is a study that was done of Israeli childcare clinics, where or daycare centers, and they had a problem with parents coming late to pick up their children. So they sent out an email to all the parents saying that we would charge you for picking up your children late. If you're late, you get a fine. And they found that actually the number of parents picking up their children late increased after they sent out that email. because people said, oh, this is just like a service we can pay for now. Okay? So he's saying previously they were picking up their children, or trying to pick up their children on time out of a sense of duty. You commodified that, you added a fine to it, and you actually reduced what you wanted them to do. It had this kind of perverse impact. So there might be a concern that something similar happens in the context of commercial surrogacy, that people are doing this out of a sense of love or a desire to benefit people in a way that they can't otherwise be benefited. They might be disincentivized, and you're left with maybe less of what you wanted, which is allowing people to have children. And I think that's very unlikely to happen, actually, in the surrogacy context. You're probably just going to get, I suspect it's true that you get more willing surrogates with a commercial system, but it means you might crowd out the altruistic forms of surrogacy. So is that a significant cost of the process? The other more, possibly more interesting objection has to do with changing the meaning or value of the outcome by commodifying it. And there are some very, very clear illustrations of this in other contexts. So if I commodified the results that students get in my courses, if I said, instead of actually marking your scripts, I'll just charge you, the person who pays me the most money will get the highest mark. That clearly corrupts the value of getting a good mark in my exam, because a good mark is supposed to be something that is reflective of your academic abilities. But now it's just something you can pay for. It's been corrupted, this good. The meaning of it has changed in society. So there are people who are concerned about that in relation to things like blood donation or kidney donation, that there's somehow some tainting of the meaning of the act if you commodify it. It's a very nebulous and sometimes not very fully worked out concern, but it is a concern that people have. And the question is that a problem with surrogacy, and is it something we should worry about? Is the only kind of desirable form of surrogacy the one that's altruistic? Well, I'll skip ahead here. Does it send the wrong signal in some way about parenthood, pregnancy, and surrogacy? Well, the thing I would caution about this is that the social meaning of a practice like paying for something, a symbolic practice like paying something for something, it also has practical consequences, but it's partly symbolic here, is highly variable between cultures. Just to give a couple of examples here, I'll wrap up on this. Is burning the bodies of dead people a mark of respect? This is a famous story from Herodotus' histories, where King Darius of Persia asked the Greeks if it was insulting to the dead to eat them. And they said, oh yes, it is very insulting to eat the dead. The true mark of respect is to burn the bodies on a funeral pyre. And then he asked another group of people, the Calations, is it a mark of respect to burn the bodies of the dead on a funeral pyre? And they said, no, that's to treat them like trash. The true way to show respect is to eat them. Okay? So it shows kind of the flexibility of the social meaning of a symbolic practice. So they both agree that you should show respect to the dead, but the symbolic practice that shows the appropriate respect varies from culture to culture. And in some cultures, actually paying for something is a way of showing the appropriate respect for something. Okay? The appropriate value, the appropriate social meaning. Here's an example. Does anyone know what this is? This is a paid mourner at a funeral in Taiwan. And there are a number of cultures around the world in which paying for people to mourn the dead is the mark of respect. And the more you pay, the better. It's a higher respect for the good or service in question. So that could be true of surrogacy too. The true way to show the mark of respect for this service is to pay for it. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.